Hi, everybody. I know it's the late night edition of Buckeye Breakdown, but after Ohio State had just beaten the number one nationally ranked Duke Blue Devils, we figured Buckeye Nation was still up. We did have some interesting football news here to go over this afternoon. So post-game show for basketball is going to actually turn into some football content for you. The Ohio State Buckeyes, number 7 ranked team in the country in the penultimate college football playoff rankings going into conference championship weekend, which, of course, the Buckeyes unfortunately will be watching from home. Does Ohio State have any chance of making the college football playoff after they came in at number 7 tonight? We'll talk about that here next. It's Buckeye Breakdown from Ohio State.
We've got the whole crew together as we cover Ohio State
with our instant analysis from Ohio State.
There's something that doesn't feel right.
Unbelievable effort from him today.
Is E.J. Liddell going to crack the first team All-Big Ten?
I think he can be the guy. I'm not trying to start a quarterback controversy.
He seems to have the durability. He certainly has the toughness. This is the question on a lot of people's minds here. Welcome to Buckeye Breakdown.
All right, welcome back to the Schottenstein Center. We're in the basketball postgame press conference room, but talking Ohio State football here this evening. Let's dive right in. Ohio State, the number 7 ranked team in the college football playoff rankings that came out just before tip-off tonight. Top 7, as you know, by this point, I'm sure, Georgia, Michigan, Alabama, Cincinnati. Those are your top 4. Oklahoma State jumps Notre Dame. Then the Notre Dame Fighting Irish and the Ohio State Buckeyes are the first of 10 straight teams in the rankings that are 10-2. They're considered the best 10-2 team, I suppose, in the country. Andrew, does Ohio State have any chance of making the college football playoff?
It's a very slim chance. It reminds me a lot of 2007, if you will. There was just a ton of chaos in that season. The way it ended, Ohio State ended up sneaking into the BCS national championship game where they got beat by LSU by 2 touchdowns. If you're going to want to, if you want Ohio State to make the college football playoff this year, you're going to need that kind of chaos on Saturday. Obviously, there's all the conference championship games, and you're going to have to be rooting for upsets in pretty much every single one of those if you want Ohio State in the Final Four teams.
I totally agree. And I don't mean to be Debbie Downer. I just don't see how it happens. I guess I can see the crazy, chaotic scenario where if Georgia wins, look, Georgia's in regardless, right? Even if they lose to Alabama, they're still going to get in the playoff. It's just a matter of where they seeded, and they still might be the 1 seed depending on how the games go. So Georgia's in. But if everybody else loses and you've got this mass chaos, I guess probably going to have to come down to how did the games go? Did Iowa boat race Michigan? Like, does all of a sudden, does Michigan have this incredible down? Does Cincinnati immediately fall out with 1 loss because they're a group of 5 team and they're on the cut right now? Is it possible for the Big 12 champion to not get in, given you're going to have 2 good teams playing against each other with a top 10 matchup? You'd think it's probably likely that one of them is going to get in, but if it's Baylor, can they jump high enough to get in? I guess I just feel like Ohio State's ceiling is probably just outside, unfortunately, especially with Oregon surging back somewhat into the mix in the top 10. And Ohio State's got 2 good losses, but their best wins now look like Michigan State, who's still highly ranked. Unfortunately, the Minnesota game, after Minnesota's a big win over Wisconsin, maybe that looks a little bit better. I don't know. I don't see how it happens.
Well, I think the difficult part of it is, you mentioned Ohio State's 2 losses. And while those are 2 teams that, are in the top 10 right now, and number 2 Michigan and number 10 Oregon, those weren't necessarily good wins. I mean, Ohio State was dominated in both of those games in the trenches. So it's not as if you can hang your hat on it and say, you know what, Ohio State could have beaten both Oregon and Michigan, because the way that they played in those games, that wasn't going to happen. But, to the point of just them being in contention, I think first and foremost, you need Alabama to get boat raced. Like, it cannot even be close, because you need to remove them completely from the equation, because I think it's really difficult if you're matching up Ohio State versus Alabama. all things out the window. It doesn't matter. We'll just say they're teams 4 and 5, and you're trying to figure out which one of those gets in. Ohio State obviously doesn't have the benefit of playing an extra game. Alabama's in an extra game. If you take that away, they only have 1 loss. So maybe Ohio State doesn't win that. I think if you're going to compare Ohio State to Notre Dame, on the other hand, say Alabama does get beat by, we'll say 28 points or something, just remove them from the equation because of that. Then you're comparing Ohio State, 2-loss Ohio State versus 1-loss Notre Dame. The committee said tonight that they would take into consideration Brian Kelly leaving Notre Dame for LSU. And, that's kind of one of those things. Notre Dame's best win, I can't really say off the top of my head.
Well, unfortunately, the Wisconsin and Purdue wins, those don't look as good as they may have previously.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that they're going to take into consideration, okay, if Ohio State played Notre Dame's schedule, what would Ohio State's record be? I would wager they'd be undefeated if they went against that schedule because, you have USC that's down, Wisconsin's down, Florida State, they almost lost there. They played Purdue, who Ohio State beat handily. It's one of those things that the only big game that Notre Dame played, they lost. So, like I said, moving forward, it's just a matter of one, you need every single team to lose. You're going to need Oregon to lose as well, because if they beat Utah, I believe they play Friday night. If they beat Utah, then you're in a conversation of, well, they just avenged a look good on their resume. They win the Pac-12. Then all of a sudden you're comparing Ohio State, 2-loss Ohio State to 2-loss Oregon. Oregon beat them head-to-head earlier this season. And it's just one of those things, like, I agree with what you're saying, that it just seems impossible, but there is still just that slim chance. And if you're an Ohio State fan wanting to make the playoff, you have to root for just pure chaos, blowouts everywhere. And it's kind of one of those things I actually wonder if, like, Ohio State might benefit more from Michigan beating Iowa really handily, because then that makes it look like that might be a good loss, because that's just how well Michigan is playing right now.
I understand that point, but I would think that given how few teams get in, be better for Ohio State to have Michigan be removed from that equation rather than getting in, because as much as those two teams might just be 2 of the top 4 teams in the country, I don't know if, without Ohio State playing this weekend, I don't know if it really is possible for Ohio State to jump up from 7 to at least 4 if Michigan doesn't fall out of that group.
I think my general thought process of it is, if Georgia wins, Georgia's number 1. Michigan wins, they're number 2. And then, if Cincinnati loses, Alabama gets beat really badly, they're out of it. Cincinnati's out of it, because it seems like the committee is trying to push Cincinnati out of it regardless. Like, they're just hanging on for dear life at 4. I even think that if Oklahoma State beats Baylor, and Baylor's a top 10 team, they're going to jump Cincinnati, and Cincinnati's going to be undefeated and left on the outside looking in. So, you kind of just root for that. So let's say Alabama loses, Cincinnati loses, Baylor beats Oklahoma State. Then you're kind of wondering, okay, well, how far does Baylor jump? Let's say Baylor goes to 3, then you're down to, like I said, Notre Dame and Ohio State for 4, and if Oregon might be in that equation if they beat Utah. So it's just a matter of, like, all those kind of things happening. And my thought with winning, well, that helps Ohio State, like, strength of schedule wise.
Sure.
So then, and this is just me completely spitballing, because I'm trying to get in the mind of the committee and that kind of aspect. But they say, throughout the whole entire season, they've talked so much about, like, who the more complete team is. Like, they don't necessarily weigh head-to-head wins because one team might be better. It just happened to not be that day. And then the fact that at the end of the day, ESPN wants to make a ton of money. And what better way would you make a ton of money than to have a semifinal with number 2 Michigan, Ohio State? Like, there has to be so many different things that goes into play there. But say Baylor does, beat Oklahoma State, then you're saying, okay, well, so Ohio State 2 losses, Baylor 2 losses. How much does the Big 12 title actually mean? Like, those kind of things. And, like I said, there is just a way, and this is totally me spitballing, but I do think that, like, if you could in some way get an Ohio State versus Michigan semifinal, like, those ratings would be absolutely through the roof.
I am willing to go as far as to say that it's a non-0% chance, but that doesn't mean that it's a good chance. I think, look, if Oklahoma State wins that game, they're in. right? Between being a top 10 Oklahoma team last week, they were in the top 10 last week, and then turning around, if they beat Baylor in the Big 12 title game, I don't know how you keep them out. I have to think that in that circumstance, and with the way Oklahoma State's defense has played this year, they're basically second in the country in defensive efficiency to only Georgia. They've been a slightly above average offense with an incredibly good defense. And they, playing well at the end of the year, winning a couple of top 10 games. If Oklahoma State wins, I think they're in. I don't know if Baylor's resume is quite strong enough to say that stamp it, they're in for sure. But I think if they win, they've got a really, really good shot at getting in the playoff. I don't think that Oregon can make the playoff. I think they're too far back. Yeah. I think the Pac-12 itself has not been strong enough this year. And if you're splitting hairs, and there's going to be some hair splitting in this scenario, I just have a really hard time thinking that a Pac-12 champion is going to get in. I don't think Iowa is capable of blowing out Michigan. They can't seem to blow out anybody, and Iowa's offense just hasn't been very good this year. But if we're playing this pie in the sky theoretical game, if Iowa wins really convincingly against Michigan, should Iowa get in? I mean, I know they lost to an unranked Purdue team, right? I know they lost to Wisconsin. Their only ranked win would be Michigan, but they were absolutely dead in the end of that game against Nebraska. I think ESPN that they had a 96.4% chance of losing, and they came back and won. Their defense causes a lot of takeaways, and if they come up with a win over number 2 ranked Michigan in the Big Ten title game, I know Iowa's 13. It's not like they surged up the rankings this week, but should Iowa get a chance?
Yeah, I mean, that just feels like it's a little bit too much. It's kind of like, Utah. I think, Utah has 3 losses, but they're just so far out that it doesn't seem like it's possible. I know, you can look back at like previous years and say, well, what was the latest that a team was, at this ranking? And, I think Oklahoma State like 3 weeks ago was at that threshold. So for them to end up being in that spot, like, it makes you wonder, like, even if Baylor wins, like if Baylor just beats Oklahoma State by like 3 points or something on Saturday, like, is that enough for them to make it to the playoffs? So, like, honestly, I think that there's maybe, like, I would say that Ohio State is probably the cutoff of teams that will, or that can make the playoff. Now, obviously, it's kind of the way that things tend to go. Georgia, might lose to Alabama. Well, then all of a sudden you have you probably have Michigan at number 1, Alabama at number 2, Georgia at 3 or 4, and then like Cincinnati or Oklahoma State. Like those are, the kind of chalk that you kind of expect. But like, if we're talking about teams that have a minuscule chance, I would say it's probably nobody any farther than Ohio State, unless you're Baylor and you blow out Oklahoma State.
Yeah, I think I can get on board with that. I'll tell you the biggest reason why I think, unfortunately, the Buckeyes are out. Ohio State and Notre Dame are both not playing this weekend. And there has to be some level of your record and your schedule matter. I think you made a good point. If Ohio State played Notre Dame's schedule, they probably wouldn't have lost a game. And if Notre Dame played Ohio State's schedule, maybe they would have lost more than one.
I have like 4 or 5 losses,
but they didn't.
Yeah,
right. And that's, I know you can make the argument, well, what if that, or maybe this. I'm looking at Notre Dame's schedule right now. I mean, their best win's probably Wisconsin, who they hammered pretty good early in the year. They beat Purdue, who's certainly a competitive team. Obviously, Notre Dame looked pretty darn good against Georgia Tech, but they've had a pretty rough go at it. They hammered Virginia. They obviously hammered Stanford. They had a couple of pretty narrow wins, especially early in the year. I mean, geez, if you'd have told me that after week 2, when Notre Dame, by the skin of their teeth, survived against Florida State and had everybody in America going, wait a second, is this team going to lose to Toledo?
Yeah.
If you'd have told me after week 2 that we'd be considering, Notre Dame as a potential playoff team, that makes me ill almost. But the thing that I I think back to with Gary Barta, you referenced the comment he made about, we would take into consideration their coaching. I didn't, the way I interpreted his comments was very open-ended. I didn't hear what he said and think to myself, okay, that means they could make Notre Dame, rule them out and say, hey, they don't have a coach right now, they're done. I thought almost it could be interpreted the opposite way, where they might say, hey, look, they don't have a coach, but should we penalize the kids for that? They've still had an 11-1 season. We'll take that into consideration, the fact they didn't have a chance to play this week. I mean, they're not going to ignore the reality of, hey, they don't have a head coach. They don't, they may not have a couple of assistant coaches. I just think that Notre Dame at 11-1 with several really convincing wins at the end of the year and no conference championship game available to them, I think it's probably not going to be in Ohio State's favor to jump Notre Dame when they've got an additional loss and they're also not playing this weekend.
It's kind of one of those things that I wish that Michigan and Notre Dame still played their annual series, because then we wouldn't be talking about this. I mean, Michigan probably would have won that as well. But, I just think the way that the committee has talked this year, it seems like they're more apt or more open to picking just the best teams, period. Like they almost don't even want to take into consideration like the schedule of things. At the end of the day, Alabama could have 3 losses and they could still feel that Alabama is one of the 4 best teams. And if that's what they feel at the end of the day, like, they're going to put Alabama in. It doesn't matter that they lost to Georgia. It doesn't matter that, that they have another loss on their schedule. So, it's just one of those things. Like, I really think that just the way they've been talking all year, it really is about, just picking who the best teams are. And to me, like, Ohio State, yes, there's no way around it. Ohio State got manhandled on Saturday by Michigan, like in the trenches on both sides of the ball. There was no real fight in that aspect. But at the rest of the season, they've talked about how dominant Ohio State was, like how well they played. And if they're taking into those things into consideration, and then you look at it and you compare it to Notre Dame and how they've played and how they struggled so much, especially early in the season, and then at the back half of the schedule, they played UVA, they played Georgia Tech, they played North Carolina, they played at Virginia Tech, only won that game by 3. Like, there are all these games that, they looked very unimpressive. They Toledo. There's all those games that they looked unimpressive. And, if you're going to put all the chips on the table and say, well, which team is a better team? I don't think that the answer to that question is Notre Dame. Like, yes, they might have 1 loss, but I mean, at the end of the day, is the committee's job not to figure out the 4 best teams?
I agree. And if Ohio State played Notre Dame, I think Ohio State would win. And I don't want to say it wouldn't be close, but I think Ohio State is at least 10 points better than Notre Dame. I just don't know if with both of them not playing this weekend and Notre Dame, even by 1 spot, it's close, right? I just don't know how the Buckeyes are going to jump them with neither team giving the committee another data point. That's back to it. But you're right. I mean, if this was a college football playoff of let's pick the 4 most talented teams in the country, and like the results were a part of the equation, and frankly, Ohio State and Alabama would be in it every year, right? I mean, this isn't just about who are the best teams when you look at 40 times and bench press numbers and, what guys have raw talent. Like Herm Edwards said it best, man. You play to win the game. And unfortunately, Ohio State lost when they had a chance to really make a statement.
Well, it's interesting too, and just the fact that like we're having this discussion now, when like say 3 years from now, we'd be like, okay, well Ohio State is now going to travel where for the first, what campus are they traveling to for the first round of the playoff, because they would be in at 7, like, so it's kind of one of those things that's just interesting to like kind of look at it from that aspect. But I just keep going back to that conversation that Barta had about just, we obviously interpreted it in a different way, but I really do think that right there is just the one thing that would put Ohio State above Notre Dame, even if they don't play, because, I don't think it's fair to take it away from the players, because the players at the end of the day are the ones who are going out there and putting Notre Dame in that position. And they're the players who are still going to be there, next season and those kind of things. So like, it sucks from that standpoint, but at the same time, like, I just don't know that if you can take Notre Dame without its head coach into it, like you take Ryan Day away from Ohio State and put them in a playoff, like does that go well? Like, if you have 3-4 weeks to play it. Like,
yeah, no, I totally understand that point. And frankly, if Notre Dame gets in the playoff, first of all, I have a hard time seeing them being a 1 or a 2 seed. They'd probably be a 4 seed. They'd probably play Georgia. And I mean, maybe those kids have the game of their life and they play super inspired football. I'm kind of inclined to believe that they'd get smoked. And we'd probably come right back here and say, see, told you so. But maybe it's in the same light as when Ohio State got in the playoff when maybe they shouldn't have a few years ago and got blown out by Clemson. There were a bunch of people around the country saying, see, that shouldn't have happened.
Should have been Penn State.
It should have been Penn State.
But I think that kind of just goes back to my point about them having those conversations and saying, okay, let's figure out the 4 best teams. Because like when you're going through the season, results happen that you don't necessarily expect to happen or shouldn't have happened. Like, you know, you can sit there and say, okay, well, a team lost on a fluke field goal or like those kind of things because they played on the road down, you know, a player, somebody got injured, like those kind of things. And all of those should be taken into consideration when you're putting forth the playoff. Like at the end of the day, the idea is to crown a national champion, and other factors that contributed to being in that situation. Like you have to take all those factors into consideration and figure out who the 4 best teams are. So, you know, all of this, the whole conversation is a moot point if you sit there and say, okay, well, Georgia wins or Alabama wins. Like, you know, those can both be in. Michigan wins, Cincinnati wins, Oregon wins. Like none of it matters for Ohio at that point. But if chaos happens, don't rule out Ohio State, because I think that the brand of Ohio State, the money that Ohio State can bring in, just, you know, how they played before the Michigan game, CJ Stroud is going to be Heisman Trophy finalist, like if not the winner of the award, like all those kind of things happen. And at the end of the day, what's the reason for playoff expansion? Money. What's the reason that, you know, ESPN pays out? Like it's just, at the end of the day, Ohio State brings all that kind of stuff in. And if there's a conversation between Notre Dame and Ohio State of who deserves to be that 4th spot, like, I don't know. I mean, might be playing Georgia here in a couple weeks. And I don't know if that necessarily goes very well. Like it might be in Ohio State's best interest to go to the Rose Bowl, play Utah, play Oregon again. Like that might be in their best interest to do it. But at the same time, like, I don't know. It's possible.
I hope you're right. I'm not going to let you talk me into thinking that way, though. Like I said, I think it is a non-chance, but I just have a really, really hard time seeing how Ohio State gets in. I think there's too many good cases for other teams. But hey, they are still relevant, and they're still there at the end of the year here.
Yeah, I mean, like I said at the beginning of the episode, like 2007. I mean, I remember watching Ohio State and Rashard Mendenhall, you know, from Illinois, run all over Ohio State. 28-21 win in Ohio Stadium. You know, Ohio State thought they were going to the Rose Bowl after beating Michigan. Beanie Wells is running around Ann Arbor with a rose in his mouth. And then the next thing you know, they're losing left and right. And then Ohio State sneaks in and plays LSU. And there was only 2 teams at that point in time. So it's not as if, you know, they have a better chance of making it now under those things. So
because there's a human element.
Yeah. Well, right? There's the human element, and then there's just more teams. So, you know, like I said, if you're an Ohio State fan and you really want to make the playoff, regardless of what actually may or may not happen once you get to the playoff, root for chaos.
I think that point is well received. Admittedly, and we can do a whole different episode on this. You know, bowl projections are starting to come out. You know, the reality is if Michigan beats Iowa, and Michigan is obviously then in playoff, Ohio State would go to the Rose Bowl as the highest ranked Big Ten did not make the college football playoff. So that becomes pretty straightforward. If Michigan loses to Iowa, Iowa would go to the Rose Bowl, or should go to the Rose Bowl. Michigan absolutely is still going to get a New Year's 6 game, and maybe they still get in the playoff because they beat Ohio State, and that's going to matter to the committee. And in that case, you know, the Ohio State Buckeyes are looking, I think, at either the Fiesta Bowl or the Peach Bowl.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure with contractual obligations, they couldn't play in the Sugar Bowl, which, to be honest with you, the reason I bring this all up, if Alabama loses, there's a little piece of me that says, look, if the Buckeyes aren't going to play in the college football playoff and the bowl game is irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, I hope Ohio State plays Alabama in a bowl game, right? It clearly isn't Alabama's best year. And obviously, Ohio State lost twice. This is a young team, and they are trying to elevate themselves to a national championship caliber. What better way for to do that than to go play Alabama? I don't want to play Oregon again.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I guess, like, if it happens, fine. But I don't really want to play Oregon. I don't really want to play Baylor. I don't think – or Utah, right. And I don't think Ohio State is going to get paired against Notre Dame in a bowl game, considering they open the season against each other next year. I guess it's possible. I think that's pretty unlikely. I would love to see, but I think it's very unlikely that Ohio State and Alabama would play in a bowl game, because Alabama can probably
go to the Sugar Bowl probably and play a Big 12 team. And,
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I agree with your point, because, you know, at this point you're wondering, like, does Ohio State have anybody who sits out? Like, does the other team have anybody who sits out, you know, because they're going to the NFL, just because, you know, whatever factors. And, you know, if there's a game that is going to keep those players around, it's against an Alabama, or, you know, the Rose Bowl, just the pageantry of the Rose Bowl, even though it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing that it has in the past, because of the playoff. And just if it's not a part of the playoff, it doesn't mean, you know, as much, but just the pageantry around it and what it means to the game and those kind of things might entice somebody. But, you know, if you can somehow get Alabama in the Peach Bowl, like I remember a couple of years ago, Florida and Michigan played in the Peach Bowl. So it's not as if an SEC and a Big Ten team haven't played each other in that game. And really, I mean, from our standpoint, you know, like Ohio State fan standpoint as well, you know, we've sat here and watched Ohio State play in a Fiesta Bowl, I think 3 times in the last, you know, 5-6 years. So
surrogate,
you know, they played in the Rose Bowl, they played in the Orange Bowl against Clemson in 2013. You know, they played in the Sugar Bowl. There's one bowl game that Ohio State fans haven't been to. It's the Peach Bowl. Now, I don't necessarily know that Atlanta is really a hot spot to go to, you know, and on New Year's, you know, those kind of things. But, you know, just something a little bit of a different perspective, something, you know, that just drives fans to that.
Well, and beyond that, I don't see a scenario where Bryce Young and CJ Stroud aren't the top 2 vote getters for the Heisman. I just think they have, in a year where the Heisman race has felt kind of wide open most of the year, I think those 2 guys, even though only one of them's playing this weekend, I think those 2 guys have kind of elevated themselves to the top of that conversation. So beyond the national brand of Ohio State playing Alabama in a bowl game, I think it'd be really cool to see, you know, probably the top 2 Heisman guys go at each other. Certainly wouldn't be hard to sell that to fans, and I think they'd get great ratings, and that's what bowl games are all about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, just from that perspective, like, it would be a good springboard for next year. You know, Ohio State obviously has a very difficult 8 games home schedule next year. You know, they kind of promoted that with the, you know, that came out a couple weeks back. But, you know, you open with Notre Dame, you have Wisconsin, you have Iowa, you have Michigan all coming to Columbus next year. You know, if you
don't count out the Indiana Hoosiers.
It kind of just reminds me, you know, a couple years ago, I want to say it was 2005. You know, Ohio State didn't necessarily have the great year. They ended it with a resounding Fiesta Bowl win over Notre Dame. Very next year, you know, they started at the top of the polls, beat Texas on the road, and that just kind of was a springboard for Troy Smith's Heisman Trophy candidacy. You know, them making it to the national championship that I know nobody wants to talk about, but yeah, I just kind of one of those things. Like, it sucks from an Ohio State perspective to lose that game to Michigan. There is still a way to kind of like end the season on a positive note, even if you don't make the playoff. You know, go into a bowl game, win your game, start out, you know, say, hey, we're young, you know, we won this game, start out next season in the top 5 and do it all over again.
We'll see how it goes. Andrew says chaos is Ohio State's friend. I agree, but I think I draw the line there. I guess I won't say it's totally impossible, but I think there is a 99.9% chance the Buckeyes are not going to make the college football playoff. Sounds like you're a little more in the 95% range.
I'd say like 99.8%. But
okay, so
even, I mean, do I like I said, do I think that Ohio State is going to do it? No, because I don't see all of that happening. Like, it, you know, Georgia's been really, really good all season. Michigan's playing its best football. Oklahoma State's been really impressive. You know, Cincinnati's holding on for dear life. And don't forget, they have a top 25 game against Houston this weekend. So, you know, that's another resume building thing. And, you know, if everybody holds serve, and then we're not even having that conversation, we're trying to figure out what bowl game Ohio State's going to.
We will find out in just over a week. Ohio, so actually not even that long, right? because it's technically now Wednesday morning. So
December 1st.
We're talking about figuring this thing out here in just a matter of a handful of days. Ohio State, we know they're playing postseason football somewhere. You can pretty much bank on it being a New Year's Six game, but which bowl and whether or not it will be part of the college football playoff, I guess, remains to be seen. Although from this corner, I think it's pretty unlikely that'll happen. Plenty more coverage over at BuckeyesNow.com. We would certainly appreciate it if you don't already. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and set your notifications so that we can interact with you on shows just like this one. And certainly we've got lots of content on our social media channels as well. If you missed tonight's game against Duke, the Buckeyes with an upset win over the number one team in the country and stormed the floor afterwards. And Andrew put a couple of pretty cool videos on Twitter that'll kind of help you relive what that moment was like. So check those out on our Twitter profiles and our social media at Buckeyes Now SI. For Andrew Lind, I'm Brendan Gulick. Good night from the Schottenstein Center. We'll talk to you again real soon. Ohio State beat Duke tonight, but we were talking college football playoff, and we got more football coverage coming your way shortly.